Good evening, Zimbabwe. My name is Hlatywayo Gladys. I am your Secretary for International Relations for your party, the Movement for Democratic Change, led by Advocate Nelson Chamisa. Welcome to this week's edition of 60 Minutes Live with the MDC, where today we are going to be talking about topical issues in terms of international relations. Today we are going to be focusing on two issues. I think you might have been seeing what's happening in South Africa in terms of the Afrophobic attacks that we have seen over the past few days. We are also going to be talking about sanctions. So what we'll do is that I will just briefly speak to those issues in terms of the party position and the way that we see things from our end. And then we can have a conversation, we can have a discussion where you give us questions and I will be able to respond. So the first issue that I'm going to tackle is the issue of xenophobia. It is really unfortunate that we continue to see, the scourge of Afrophobic attacks in South Africa. This is not the first time that it has been happening. We have seen this, I think the worst attack was in 2008, if I still remember well. And we had several deaths, including Zimbabweans that were actually affected. And again, this is happening, and we have Zimbabweans that are affected. I think we know that we have more than 3 million Zimbabweans that are staying in South Africa. And so these issues definitely affect us as a nation, as a country. I will raise 5 issues that I think we need to discuss when we are talking about the Afrophobic attacks that we are seeing in South Africa. I'm deliberately calling them Afrophobic attacks because xenophobia seems to suggest that the attacks are against foreigners. But if we do an analysis of what is happening in South Africa, you would actually see that it's not just Africans, it's not just foreigners, but it's specifically Africans. And it's really disturbing. Number one, because it's a negation of our Pan-Africanism as a continent. I think, the doyens of Pan-Africanism, the likes of Julius Malema Nyerere, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah should be turning in their graves, because this is what they, died fighting. They died fighting for unity of Africans, for unity of Africa, for solidarity amongst Africans. And so this is really a negation of what we believe in as a people, as Africans. And one would have expected more love, more unity, more solidarity amongst Africans, but this is not what we are seeing in South Africa. We have the Human Rights Watch, which is an organization that looks at human rights. They released a report showing that since March of this year, we have had 200 truck drivers being killed in South Africa because of these Afrophobic attacks. We have had 5 people that were killed over the last few days because of the violence that we are seeing in South Africa. And this is really worrying. We are deeply worried. We are concerned as the Movement for Democratic Change. And from a Pan-African perspective, we don't expect these things to be happening. We expect more solidarity, more unity amongst Africans, and not self-hate that we are seeing. I think number 2 is around our African philosophy of Ubuntu. The philosophy that I am because you are, the philosophy that recognizes the interdependency, the interconnectedness of the human race. Definitely what is happening when people stone people to death, when people burn people to death, that is an absolute negation of the African philosophy of Ubuntu. Number 3 is around the fact that the region and the continent are moving towards integration, economic and political integration of the African continent. And this we find in the vision of the various documents that have been produced by the African Union as well as the Southern African Development Community. For instance, the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself speaks to the issues around the need for unity and the need for solidarity. The SADC Common Agenda also speaks to the issues of integration. The SADC Indicative Strategic Development Plan also emphasizes issues of integration, and actually, then goes further to actually give milestones in terms of what SADC countries are supposed to do as we move towards regional integration. So this actually goes against the aspirational vision of Africa as a continent and SADC as a region. There is also, number 4, there is also a lot of revisionism, because if you look at the role that African countries played in terms of the independence of South Africa, the anti-apartheid struggle was a struggle that was owned by the entire continent. We had, our philosopher kings again making reference to the likes of Julius Malema Nyerere, all the Pan-African, Pan-African leadership galvanizing the entire continent in support of the anti-apartheid struggle. As a matter of fact, we had countries that were bombed by the apartheid regime for supporting, for providing moral and material support to the anti-apartheid struggle in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. In Zimbabwe here, we actually housed, a number of, ANC stalwarts that were, in this country during the apartheid period. There were military camps, Morogoro in Tanzania, camps in Zambia, camps in Mozambique, where people were housing the ANC, Umkhonto weSizwe, helping them to make sure that, South Africa was going to be an independent country. So what is happening in South Africa is also revisionism, because it doesn't take into account all of this support that the South Africans received from the various African countries. It is also, which is number 5, a gross, it goes against regional, continental and international instruments of human rights. At an international level, we are talking about, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are talking about the African Charter, on people's and human and people's rights. All of these instruments, they reinforce human rights, and it is important for the South African government to make sure that foreigners in South Africa are protected, and their rights are guaranteed in terms of the conduct that we are seeing in South Africa. So in terms of our recommendations, we are recommending that South Africa, and of course the rest of the region, must be able to do an analysis of some of the domino effects that we are seeing. For instance, here in Zimbabwe, for a very long time as the MDC, we've been calling for the South African government, for the Southern African Development Community to intervene in terms of helping Zimbabweans to solve the political crisis that we are seeing, that came from a disputed election in 2018, an election that was not held in terms of regional standards on elections, democratic elections. And this is the reason why we are now seeing the manifestations in terms of the socio-economic challenges that the country is facing, which is then forcing Zimbabweans to flock to South Africa, crossing Limpopo in search of better opportunities that are not provided for here in Zimbabwe, and also running away from the human rights abuses that are in Zimbabwe. So the region must be able to focus on some of these challenges that are being faced from the home countries where immigrants are coming from, with a view of actually making sure that those countries become democratic developmental states that deliver in terms of not just political and civil rights, but also social and economic rights of their citizens, so that we limit the challenges that South Africa is facing. We have always insisted that for South Africa, Zimbabwe is not a foreign policy issue, but it is a domestic issue because of these domino effects that I was talking about. So that is definitely one of the first recommendations that we make as the MDC. The second recommendation is obviously to urge the South African government to act on the attacks, with a view of protecting foreigners and guaranteeing their safety. I think it's very important for the South African government to take proactive steps to actually make sure that they mitigate what is happening in South Africa rather than remaining quiet. We also would like to see accountability in terms of the people that have been attacked and the perpetrators that were perpetrating some of these crimes. We also encourage South African leaders to desist from inflammatory language. I think we have been seeing quite a number of South African leaders speaking to, South African citizens and insinuating that the challenges that South Africa is facing at the present moment are a product of, foreigners, which we think, is untrue. We totally understand that the victims of apartheid today are still victims of poverty, and it is important for the South African government to look into these issues and have a holistic way of addressing the challenges that ordinary South Africans are facing. So I think in terms of, Afrophobia, these are the issues that I wanted to share with you. I will then go to the second issue, and maybe we can then have a conversation at the end after my brief remarks. I think we are all aware that the Southern African Development Community made a resolution to the effect that they have declared an anti-sanction day for Southern African Development Community, where the various member states are supposed to do activities in solidarity with, ZANU-PF, to be quite honest. Our view as the MDC is that the sanctions debate is now a very tired debate. I think if we still recall the very first days of this, so-called new dispensation, we remember that, one of the key things that they used to say is that we don't need to be always crying that there are sanctions. And I like to call them restrictive measures, because they are not sanctions actually. They are restrictive measures, targeted sanctions, targeted at certain individuals that have been perpetrating human rights, certain companies, travel bans, arms embargo, among some of the measures. And so we feel that the sanctions debate is being resuscitated by SADC, and it's really unfortunate because it doesn't go to the, to the center of the problem. The problems in Zimbabwe are not caused by sanctions. The problems in Zimbabwe, what we are actually seeing, the sanctions debate is actually a smoke screen, and does not speak to exactly the challenges that Zimbabwe is facing. The problems that Zimbabwe, is facing, it is politics, stupid, if I can call it that. The issues that we are facing is that we have, a nauseating governance culture. We have the decomposition of the political. We have corruption. We have patronage. We have clientelism. We have, some kind of a patrimonial state. We have a leadership, crisis, leadership ineptitude. We have captured institutions. These are the problems that Zimbabwe is facing. And anything else, to be quite honest, we'll be imagining things. These are the challenges that are, prohibiting Zimbabwe from becoming the kind of state that we would want to be. And, it is because of these challenges that we have had problems in terms of our international relations thrust. We need to understand as Zimbabweans that whatever happens at an international relations level is also informed by our domestic policy. I do not understand the logic of ZANU-PF when they say that the world must not be focusing on, their human rights record, the fact that they are maiming, raping, killing citizens here in Zimbabwe, like we saw on August 1st, like we saw on the January clampdown, like we saw just a few days ago when we were trying to exercise our democratic right to demonstrate and petition. Honestly, the world cannot just sit and watch whilst ZANU-PF is violating human rights that are enshrined in our constitution, that are enshrined in international human rights instrument. So it's important for the Zimbabwean government the Zimbabwean regime to actually acknowledge some of these deficiencies and work towards rectifying them. It is not going to help us to hire expensive PR firms like the Ballards of this world to do advocacy or lobby and advocacy on our behalf when we are killing our own people on the ground, because talk is cheap people actually look at what we are doing on the ground and then make decisions on the basis of those actions that we'll be doing. So it's important for us to realize that as a people, as a country, and to rectify some of these challenges. There's something that is very, disturbing that I read from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, SB Moyo, when he was saying that remove sanctions so that we can respect human rights. Honestly, I do not understand that, that kind of thinking at all. In our own constitution, if you look at Chapter 4, the Bill of Rights, it speaks to a whole gamut of social and economic rights as well as civil and political rights. We need to respect those rights if we are to be seen as a serious player in terms of international relations. We need to abide by our laws, we need to abide by our constitution for us to be taken seriously by the international community. So definitely our domestic policy has ramifications on our international relations engagement. This is why, as the MDC, we have insisted that we need to reload as a country. We have developed our return to economic recovery, legitimacy, openness, and democracy, where we are identifying 5 key steps that are necessary in terms of making sure that we make headway as a country. Number 1 being exactly what we are doing as a political party, building pressure both diplomatically and politically to achieve, which is number 2, to have a dialogue, a national dialogue that is bankable, a national dialogue that is mediated and scaffolded by the international community. The current process that E.D. Mnangagwa is doing at State House, we do not believe in it. We are on record to say, it is a big jamboree. It's not a very serious process. And, we need to make sure that if we are sincere on dialogue, we need to make sure that we have a mediator. The international community is also involved for it to be a credible process. Number 3, we need to have comprehensive reforms. I think if there is anything that the past few days, in terms of the reign of this regime has taught us, is that we have problems in terms of reforms. If you look at the way that the state media behaves and conducts itself, you see that there is need for media reforms. The way that our security forces conduct themselves, you see that there is need for security sector reform. You would see that we need electoral reforms. Right now, the constitution gives the right to vote to every Zimbabwean, including those that are in the diaspora, but that has not been realized. So there is need for electoral reforms, aligning our electoral law to the supreme law of the land, which is the constitution. So these reforms are very, very necessary if we are to deal with the issues, the problems that we are seeing in Zimbabwe. After, and we know that ZANU-PF is not the vehicle that is in a position to implement these comprehensive reforms. If they were the vehicle, certainly since 2013, when we had the new constitution, they would have implemented all of the necessary reforms in line with the new constitution. But clearly there is lethargy on reforms, and we need to make sure that we have another vehicle that is given a time frame that is set to implement these reforms, so that we then get to the final stage where we have a free and fair election that is not disputed. So this is what we are saying as the MDC. This is our message in terms of what we need to do as a country. I just wanted to also say it's now very clear that the regime that we have in Zimbabwe is not a regime that is willing to reform at all. It's not a regime that respects democracy. It's not a regime that respects constitutionalism, because if they did, They were not going to kill the citizens, they were not going to maim citizens, they were not going to rape women, and we were going to exercise our rights as citizens in this country. Just going back to the issue of the sanctions debate, it is really unfortunate that ZANU-PF is using sanctions to get away from the responsibility that they have and the failure. We have always insisted that the crisis that Zimbabwe is facing is a political one, and it's threefold. What we have is actually a legitimation crisis that is happening at three levels. The first level is obviously the fact that we had a rigged election. We had an election that did not express the will of the people. And so at an input level, you do not have legitimacy. This government does not have legitimacy. But also there is a performance legitimacy deficit, where this government has clearly failed to meet the needs of the people in terms of the social and economic rights. The fact that we are going on for more than 18 hours without power, the fact that prices are skyrocketing, the fact that when prices are skyrocketing, the salaries remain static, the state of the public service in this country is really appalling. You would have thought that the regime was supposed to also cushion civil servants, but we seem not to be seeing that. And what is proposed by the government in terms of the cushioning is definitely not in line with the inflation rate in Zimbabwe. So all of those challenges are challenges. The health sector has collapsed, the public health sector, education, all of those issues point to an output or a performance legitimacy problem where the government is actually failing to deliver. But you also have a throughput legitimacy issue or a deficit where, in terms of the efficacy and effectiveness of governance processes, you actually see that, there's a deficit. This is why, the government does not believe in citizens, freely expressing themselves, citizens freely enjoying their rights and exercising their rights. This is why we also have, grant corruption happening in government. The kind of corruption that is happening in government is really heartbreaking. For a country that is facing serious social and economic challenges, you would think that the government is supposed to be a little bit sympathetic and also act above board, but that's not what we are seeing. The kind of corruption that have been unearthed by the Auditor General, the kind of corruption that has been unearthed by the Public Accounts Committee points to a regime that is not changed at all, despite its rhetoric around the new dispensation. It is now very clear that we don't have a new dispensation whatsoever, but we have a new deception. This is a continuation of the past, if not an escalation of the past regime. There is no change whatsoever. I think with that, I would like to thank you all for participating in this session, and look forward to interacting with you further. Thank you very much, and good evening to you all.